So to begin with, we need to define what is inflation. In the classical view, it says that inflation is about a change in the price level, and it is merely a change in the units of measurement. If you remember what we learned from chapter 2, which is what we learned from last semester, we said that the inflation rate equals the percentage rate of increase in the price index per period. So that is the definition for inflation. So then, what are the causes of expected inflation? Well, when there is inflation, it means that the price increases. When the price increases a lot, for example, 5% or 10%, as a rational individual, what we want to do when facing the expected inflation rate. It turned out that the first cost that will occur when facing the expected inflation rate is the shoe leather cost. So what are the shoe leather costs? Well, when you put the money in the bank, it's going to give you the interest rate. And we know that when people are considering the asset allocation, we are considering the real interest rate. Given that the nominal interest rate moves together with the inflation rate, therefore, when the inflation rate is high, then people will prefer to put the money in the bank instead of putting it in your own pockets. Because when you put the money in your pocket, it will not give you any return. But if you put the money in the bank, it's going to give you at least the nominal interest rate, and it's roughly moved together with the inflation rate. Therefore, when the inflation rate is high, people will prefer to put the money in the bank than in the pocket. So then when we want to use money, what happens is that we need to go to the bank more often. When we go to the bank more often, then it means that the shoes will get wear out more easily. So then there will occur the shoe leather cost. And that is the first cause of the expected inflation. Is there any other cause for the expected inflation? Yes, there is. The other cost is called the menu cost. That is, when there is inflation, then for a restaurant, they need to change the menu because they may need to raise the price for the food that they sell. And so these are the two causes of the expected inflation. One is the cost that in response to a higher inflation, you need to take some action to reduce the impact of the expected inflation. The other is the cost that it will occur when you want to react to the inflation, and you will do some business adjustment to deal with the expected inflation, and that is the menu cost. So then, what are the costs of the unexpected inflation? It turned out that it will cause the wealth redistribution, and why it is so. So now let's take a look at the first case, that is the realized inflation rate is greater than the expected inflation rate. It turned out that when we compute the real interest rate, if we compute the real interest rate using the realized inflation rate, then we are going to get the exposed real interest rate, and that is I minus pi. And when we compute the real interest rate using the expected inflation rate, which is the ex ante real interest rate, then it will be I minus pi e. So given that the realized inflation rate is greater than the expected inflation rate, so then the exposed real interest rate is less than the ex ante real interest rate. Because the pi is greater than pi e, so I minus pi will less than I minus pi e. Therefore, we claim that under the first case, the realized real interest rate is less than the expected real interest rate. So then what happened is that when people sign the contract for borrowing and lending, they need to sign it before the inflation rate occurs. So because of that, the contract is set based on the expected real interest rate. The contract is set to be the expected real interest rate, and it turned out to be higher than the realized. So then it turned out that for the people that is receiving the return before the inflation occurs, they expect to receive, for example, 5%, and they turn out to end up to get only 2% real interest rate. So then people lending the money will get hurt because they get less than they expected. But then for the borrower, they turn out to benefit from it because they are expected to pay more, but then they turn out to pay less. Therefore, for the first case, when the realized inflation rate is greater than the expected inflation rate, then we say the borrower will benefit from this scenario. Because of that, there is a wealth transfer from the lender to the borrower, because the lender got hurt when the realized inflation rate is greater than the expected inflation rate. So then it is more like transferring wealth from the lender to the borrower. Now let's take a look at the second case, which is the opposite of the previous one. That is, the realized inflation rate is less than the expected inflation rate. So what happened is that now the I minus pi is greater than I minus pi e, because pi e now is greater than pi. That is, the realized inflation rate is less than expected. So then it turned out that the exposed real interest rate is greater than the exonted real interest rate. So then what happened is that if you borrow money, you expect to pay the real interest rate, that is, for example, 5%. Then after the inflation realized, you turn out to pay 10%, because the realized real interest rate is higher than the expected real interest rate. So for example, 5 versus 10. So then it turned out that the lender will benefit from this case and the borrower will hurt from this scenario, because the borrower now needs to pay more than they expected and the lender now gets more than they expected. Therefore, the implication for the second scenario is that the lender benefits. Because lender benefits, so then we say that under this scenario, it is as if transferring the wealth from the borrower to the lender. So then that is the cost of the unexpected inflation. So when there is an unexpected inflation, then it means that the realized real interest rate is different from the expected real interest rate. Because of this gap, so then there will cause some wealth redistribution between the lender and the borrower, and that is the cause of the unexpected inflation. So now we know some problems of the inflation. We already mentioned the cost of the expected inflation, which includes the shoe leather cost and the manual cost. We also said that the cost of the unexpected inflation is about the wealth redistribution. Therefore, it is the third problem of the inflation. There are some other problems of inflation too. One is that when we face unexpected inflation, then there will be higher uncertainty for the returns. Because of that, it will be costly to predict the inflation to hedge the risk. So that's the other problem of inflation. The other problem of the inflation is that the price will lose its value as signaling the equilibrium of the supply and the demand, because the price just changed because there is some factor causing the changes in the price, other than that the increase in the price is due to the demand is higher than the supply. So then the problem of inflation is that it will cause the resource misallocation. So a vendor, when they see the price increase, they take it as there is an increase in demand such that the price got increased, then they will choose to produce more goods. But when they choose to produce more goods, then the supply got increased, then they will later on find out that, gosh, the price got increased is not because there are more people wanting the goods, but just simply because of the inflation, for example, caused by the government printing too much money. So then the problem of the inflation is that it will cause the risk misallocation. And then this problem will be more serious when we face hyperinflation, which will be a term we introduced later. But basically, hyperinflation is a very serious scenario of inflation. So we have been talking about the bad things about inflation, but when there's bad things about inflation, is there any good things about inflation? It turned out to be the answer is yes. And let's take a look at why that is so. In the labor market, a lot of time, we say that when the people are determining how much labor they want to supply, and when the firms want to determine how much labor they want to demand, they are making the decision based on the real wages. When we are talking about the real wages, it is the nominal wages take out the impact of inflation, and then what's left will be the real wages. The problem of the wages is that if we look at the nominal terms, it's rarely got reduced, because if your boss tell you that your salary used to be $1,000 per hour, but right now the value of the good that you produce got less, so then your wage right now is only $800, for example. If your boss says that from tomorrow onward, I'm going to cut your wage from $1,000 to $800, most of you will feel very sad about it. So it's difficult to adjust the nominal wage. But that's okay. We can still adjust the wage downward as long as when we are making the decision, we focus on the real wages. Then even though the nominal wage doesn't change, as long as there's inflation, then it can reduce the real wages downward without adjusting the nominal wages downward. So then people will not be that upset. So here I say the nominal wage rarely got reduced. So when the real wage in equilibrium should fall, but we can't, especially the nominal wage cannot be adjusted, the labor market clearing will be hindered, because if there's no inflation at all and the nominal wages cannot be changed, then it means that the real wage cannot be changed. When the real wage cannot be changed, and then somehow the equilibrium suggests that the real wage should fall, but the wage cannot be fall, then it will cause higher unemployment, because the market is not clear. So in here, if the real wages in equilibrium cannot be adjusted downward, then the labor market clearing is hindered. To resolve this issue, that is a good thing about inflation, is that it allows the real wages to adjust downward without adjusting downward the nominal wages. So then we say the existence of the inflation rate is good somehow, because a moderate inflation rate can improve the functioning of the labor market.